We have just finished examining the first of the two approaches by which men have justified the use of violence in the name of Christianity. The second approach, which has been used typically to justify violence in the name of the teachings of Jesus, is a little more subtle than the first. Basically, the approach runs like this. What is said is that, admittedly, Jesus taught a doctrine of love, of reconciliation, and of forgiveness. But there are those situations in which that doctrine is simply not applicable. There are those situations, that is, where love, taught by Jesus as seen in the New Testament, admits to the use of violence. What is being said, in other words, is that the situation determines the content of agape. That agape, or Christian love, has no concrete content of its own. The analogy that is often used, of course, is that in the situation where you have two men who are injured, if you give one the same thing as you give the other, you could poison the one and cure the other. One man's poison is another man's medicine. The way you determine whether you are going to give the one man one medicine and one man another is by the concrete realities of the situation. Namely, what you do is you determine what the needs are there and you give appropriately. Therefore, it is derived from that love, as taught by Jesus, has no concrete content. That what takes place is that you must determine in each situation what the requirements of it are. The technical name for this, of course, is situation ethics. I submit to you that on one level, when one is determining what one should do vis-a-vis a human situation, one is always using some principle, whether he articulates it or not. He is always using some concrete idea or concept that he is bringing to that situation, that he is trying to manifest, that he is trying to make workable in it. And that content, and that idea has content, whether he is willing to articulate it or not. Beyond that, I think we have to face the reality that the entire gospel, as revealed in the New Testament, is something not any different than an attempt to articulate Christian love. An attempt to articulate the content of Christian love. That segment of the gospel that has probably been more written about, that has probably been more employed in reflecting on the meaning of Jesus and his teaching, is what's called the gospel within the gospel, namely the Sermon on the Mount. If one were to look at any one place to say what is the content of Jesus' idea of love, one would look to the Sermon on the Mount. Let's examine a few passages from that. Paragraph 1 of what's called the New and the Old Standard reads as such: "You have learned how it was said to your ancestors, 'You must not kill.' But I say to you, do not get angry." Paragraph 4 reads, "You have learned how it was said to your ancestors, 'An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth.' But I say to you, offer the wicked man no resistance. On the contrary, if anyone hits you on the right cheek, offer him the other as well. If a man takes you to law and would have your tunic, let him have your cloak. And if anyone orders you to go 1 mile, go 2 miles. Give to anyone who asks, and if anyone wants to borrow, do not turn him away. Paragraph 5 reads, you have learned how it was said, you must love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, and in this way you will be sons of your Father in heaven. Now I submit to you that what's being said there is that the love that Jesus is talking about is in fact a love that rejects violence in human affairs. That those 3 paragraphs are giving content to the Christian idea of love. That agape is not a contentless word. To argue that it is means the following. Paragraph 2 reads, in the same section that I have just read to you, you have learned how it was said of old, you must not commit adultery. But I say this to you, you must not lust after a woman. Those people who wish to argue that the New Testament concept of love is independent of any content other than the situation have to bear the burden of point-blankly allowing for the possibility that adultery and lust are consistent with Jesus' teaching on love as found in the New Testament. Why? Because paragraph 2 of the Sermon on the Mount, of the higher and lower standard, paragraph 2 explicitly excludes adultery and lust as consistent with the will of God, as consistent with Christian love, as inconsistent, that is, with the teachings that Jesus was talking about as God's will. But if it is taken in such a way that one can say that Jesus' recommendations that simply prohibit adultery and lust are not the content of agape, then very well. Then we can say that his rejection of violence is not the content of agape. But what we can't do is, we cannot say that paragraph 2 of the Sermon on the Mount gives agape or Christian love an objective content, and that paragraphs 1, 5, and 6 that reject violence are not part of the content of agape. We cannot have it both ways. Either the content of Christian love rejects violence, lust, adultery, or it doesn't reject them. I submit to you, there are very few people who say that Jesus gave us a contentless word in love who would agree that Jesus' teachings approve of lust and adultery. As a matter of fact, it reaches the point of being an absurdity to say both. Jesus rejected retaliation, revenge, killing, violence, and he also rejected lust and adultery. And how explicitly can you say it than to say, you have learned of old an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, offer the wicked man no resistance. If anyone hits you on the right cheek, offer him the other. You have heard it said of old that you must love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I say to you, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. How clear can you make it? Are those statements any less clear than you have heard it said of old, you must not commit adultery, but I say to you, you must not lust after a woman? Clearly, agape has a content. Clearly, New Testament love is not totally defined by the situation. But let's look at it from another point of view. What is the essence of the Sermon on the Mount? The essence of the Sermon on the Mount is the presupposition of the Sermon on the Mount is that a man becomes what he thinks. As you think, so also you will act. When the Sermon on the Mount says, "You have heard it said of old, you shall not kill, but I say to you, do not get angry. You have heard it said of old, you shall not commit adultery, but I say to you, you shall not lust." What's being talked about there is that if you dissolve the thought in the desire, the action cannot possibly follow. A man becomes what he thinks. Dissolve the thought and the action cannot follow. Nurture the thought and the action will follow as sure as night follows day. Dissolve the thought of anger and there's no way in the world one will ever reach the point of committing homicide. Dissolve the thought of lust and there's no way one will ever reach the point of engaging in adultery. Jesus is concerned about the reorganization of human consciousness, motivation, and of the human conscience. It is extraordinarily important to recognize that the understanding of the New Testament, as explicitly laid out in the Sermon on the Mount, is that mind style produces lifestyle, produces community style. That conversion, the change of mind and heart, is a personal phenomenon, but that it has social implications and interpersonal implications. Change of mind style, produces change of lifestyle, produces change of community style. What is being said is that if I think differently, I'll act differently. And if enough people think differently in the community will act differently. Jesus is not talking about doing things the other way around. It's an impossibility to change the community before changing the heart, the soul, the mind, the motivation of the people within the community. I think it's important that we understand that Jesus is not the only Messiah. Where does the term Messiah come from? Well, some people learn it early in life, some people learn it late in life, some people never learn it at all. Most communities, after a while, figure it out. Figure what out? That reason alone is insufficient for overcoming evil and death. If you can figure out how to overcome evil, and if you can figure out how to overcome death with just reason, then go ahead and do it. But if you can't, and most people find that they can't, then people go looking for some other extra reasonable source, some source of communication other than reason to tell them how to overcome evil and death, to answer the ultimate questions in human existence. At that point there, they may go looking for ways to communicate with the divine through oracles, or through birds, or through sand, or what have you. One way that they go looking to communicate with the divine and to find out what the meaning and purpose of human existence is, how to overcome evil and death, they go looking for special people that the divine sends or the divine uses to communicate what the purpose of human existence is. These special people, or these anointed people by God, if you will, then tell them what is the purpose of human existence, what kind of God God is, what He expects, how to overcome evil and death. The word Messiah means the anointed one. Jesus is a Messiah because Jesus answers the question, what kind of God is God if God exists, and what does He expect of man? Jesus tells men how to overcome evil and death. But Jesus is just one of literally thousands or tens of thousands of messiahs, or maybe hundreds of thousands, who have existed, who do exist at this very moment. That is, of people who claim to be the communication channel between God and man on how to overcome evil and death. Therefore, it becomes extraordinarily important that we simply look at the reality. And the reality is that one can choose among a panoply or a plethora of messiahs. The reality is that Jesus is a choice, and his way is a choice. It is not the only choice, it is one of many, but it is a choice. Now, if one chooses Jesus as the way of overcoming evil and death, and then distorts his message or his teaching, then one is involved in absurdity. To say that this is the man that shows me how to overcome evil and death, and then simultaneously to distort his message, is the height of irrationality. Let me explain something here. Here are three premises, self-evident premises. Let's examine them. One, if God in fact exists, what's being said in that premise is not that God does exist, but if God exists. That is, if God is just not some word that's conjured up by the imagination out of man's fears. Two, if God in fact reveals his will. There is no real need for God to reveal his will, even if God exists. God's will, of course, can often be nothing more than, or be argued to be nothing more than, simply man's hopes or man's desires or man's way of justifying what he wants done. All kinds of things have been done in God's will, in the name of God's will. But if in fact God reveals his will. Third, if man cannot by his own reason figure out how to overcome, conquer evil and death. That is, if man, using his own logical and reasonable processes, cannot figure out how to overcome evil and death. Now let's look at the three of them again. These are premises. They are not to be proved. What is being said here is, reflect on these thoughts yourself, and if they're true, something is going to follow. So the three of them. If there is in fact a God, answer that yourself. If God in fact reveals his will, answer that yourself. Three, if man cannot by his own reason figure out how to overcome evil and death, answer that question yourself. Can you figure out how to overcome evil and death? Then, or therefore, it is logically inevitable that the revealed will of God will be at some point different from what man's finite common sense would have told him. What's being said? What's being said is that if you cannot by your own reason figure out how to overcome evil and death, then what God reveals is going to be something other than you would have reached reasonably as the way to do it. In simple, straightforward terms, what's being said is, if reason is sufficient, then revelation is unnecessary. But if revelation is required, then reason is insufficient. But if revelation is required, then there is going to be some difference between what my reason would have said was the way to approach life, evil, and death, and what revelation is saying. There would be some difference between my common sense on how to live and what revelation would say. If my finite common sense was sufficient, then we would not need revelation. There must be a difference. Let me explain this a little bit further. What is being talked about is simply this. Suppose we take this circle to be all reality, the microcosm, the macrocosm, the stars, the grains of sand, the minds, the eyes. This circle here is all that this is all of reality. All there is that can be known. Out of this entire reality, how much of reality does our finite mind know? How much of all there is to know does our finite mind grasp? A speck. Just a speck. We would, as small as this speck is, it in no way is analogous to how little we know in terms of the macrocosm and the microcosm. As small as this little speck is. Therefore, it really is not so absurd to say that in judging how we should live human existence, how is evil and death to be overcome, it is not so absurd to say that common sense is insufficient. Why? Because common sense is totally derived from this little bit of knowledge out of all the reality that there is. Our common sense is the product of a tiny little bit of knowledge of a little speck of reality out of almost an infinite amount of reality. From that little speck of knowledge, we make judgments on right and wrong. Is it so absurd to say that perhaps common sense might say on the one structure of it that I should kill, but that in the larger frame of things, that retaliation is totally destructive, that it is not what we're here for, it's not how to live, it's not the way to go through existence, it's not the way to overcome evil and death, and it's not the way to survive. Reason is not to be used in the Christian sense as a way of modifying the teachings of Jesus, as a way and a gimmick of finding a path around the teachings of Jesus. Reason is to be employed as a way of finding out how to fulfill the teachings of Jesus. We often hear that in this situation, it is impossible not to be violent. It is impossible to follow the teachings of Jesus. When someone says that in such a situation it is impossible to follow the teachings of Jesus, one is saying that there is a situation in which Jesus Christ could not have been Jesus Christ. Jesus teaches that love, agape, is always sufficient in human relationships, and therefore violence is never necessary. The reality is this: the gospel is simple to understand, and it's also simple to execute, as is Christian love, providing one is willing to suffer. But if one does not want to suffer, then we get the theology libraries full of tomes that teach us and that try to explain to us why Jesus did not mean what he says he meant. Why the most obvious statements like love your enemy and return good for evil really mean hate your enemy and return evil for evil. A famous priest theologian, biblical theologian, was once on a television panel in the late 1950s with a number of other erudite men from other professions, a moral theologian, a political scientist, a lawyer. And in the hour program, what they were discussing was the moral legitimacy of keeping people out of your atomic bomb shelter if the sirens blew and you had made a bomb shelter and they hadn't. What would you do if the sirens blew for atomic war, you had a bomb shelter, and people came knocking at your door, and that your bomb shelter could only hold you and no one else? It could not hold two, it could just hold one. Well, for a half of the hour program, the various moral experts and political experts and legal experts simply argued the point back and forth, and this priest theologian, biblical theologian, who is normally quite verbose, said nothing. About halfway into the program, the moderator said, "Father, you haven't said a word on this subject, and yet you are normally quite talkative. What is the problem?" And the priest said, "The problem is that there's no problem in what you're discussing." And the moderator said, "I don't understand." And the priest said that for a Christian, there is no problem in this situation. And the moderator said, "Well, what should a Christian do in this situation?" And the priest said, "It's obvious what a Christian should do. He should get out of his bomb shelter and give it to the person." And everyone sat back rather stunned and said, "Well, that's crazy. That's irrational. That's not even consistent with common sense." And the priest said, "The Christian is guaranteed survival forever if he just lives his Christian life. Christian love, agape, only exists in the real situation. If you don't love the neighbor here and now, where he needs to be loved, then you never love. Clearly, what this neighbor needs is to be loved, to be given the bomb shelter." Faith, Christian faith, tolerates moderation in love of neighbor no more than it tolerates moderation in love of God. The Christian faith tolerates prudence in love of neighbor no more than it tolerates prudence in love of God. The Christian is guaranteed survival. He simply lays down his life for his fellow man. He doesn't use machine guns to keep him out. The gospel is simple to understand. The gospel is simple to execute, providing one is willing to suffer. Hard, yes, but not difficult to understand. It is of extraordinary importance, of course, that to realize that in this whole process we are talking about a way of life that most people would simply disagree with. We are talking about a way of life that most people say runs against common sense. To say something is not consistent with common sense is irrelevant. Common sense tells you such things as the earth is flat, such things as the stars are up there. We know the earth is oval. We know the stars are up there and down there and over there and behind us. Common sense tells us there's no such things as cells and atoms. Common sense tells us that the cross is folly. As it says in the New Testament, the cross was folly to the Greeks and a scandal to the Jews, totally inconsistent with common sense. But for the Christian, the cross, suffering love, suffering nonviolent love, total forgiveness, is the power and the wisdom of God. The reality is that it's easy to say, it's simple to say, well, I'll be a Christian, but if the people around me aren't Christian, if only everyone else was Christian, I'd be glad to be Christian. If only everyone else was engaged in nonviolent love, I would, but everyone else isn't. I submit to you that at no place in the New Testament does Jesus say that his followers are relieved of their responsibility to live according to his teaching simply because no one else is living according to his teaching.